In the final months of 1942, as summer faded from the southern Russian steppe and the dust of retreating harvest winds clung to every movement across the plains, the Italian Eighth Army took up its positions along a long, vulnerable curve of the Don River. This force, roughly 235,000 men organized into 10 divisions, had been sent by Mussolini to reinforce Hitler's ambitious drive into the Soviet Union during Operation Blau, the German offensive aimed at capturing Stalingrad and pushing south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. The Italians, commanded by General Italo Garibaldi, occupied the longest sector of any Axis ally on the Eastern Front, more than 170 kilometers of exposed riverbank and open steppe. Their deployment reflected a strategic hope, but also a fatal miscalculation. The Italian soldiers, many of them conscripts from every region of Italy, carried weapons and equipment ill-suited for the mechanized war unfolding in the East. Their standard Carcano rifles were reliable but outdated. Their anti-tank guns, especially the 47-32 model, were almost useless against the sloped armor of the Soviet T-34. Their armor division possessed only small L-640 light tanks, vehicles with thin armor and underpowered guns that could not compete against Soviet armor. Italian artillery, in many cases dating back to the First World War, lacked the firepower needed for sustained defensive operations. Worst of all, winter clothing was scarce. Soldiers wore thin wool uniforms that offered little protection against the brutal cold soon to come. In August and September, as these divisions stretched themselves along the Don, the front remained mostly quiet. Italian engineers dug trenches and built bunkers with the help of local Soviet civilians conscripted into labor units. The men settled into a routine marked by occasional artillery exchanges and small-scale reconnaissance clashes. But beneath this surface calm lay persistent problems: insufficient ammunition, minimal motor transport, unreliable communication lines, and a growing awareness that the German High Command prioritized its own forces at Stalingrad over the needs of its allies. The Italians held a front far too long for their troop density, with wide gaps between strongpoints that would prove disastrous once a major Soviet attack began. That attack would soon come. In November, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, the massive double envelopment that encircled the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. The collapse of the Romanian armies on both flanks of the German position sent shockwaves across the Axis lines. The Italian command along the Don, already worried about its overstretched defenses, now understood that their turn was likely next. The Soviets had identified the Italian sector as one of the weakest points on the entire southern front. At dawn on December 16, 1942, the sky erupted. Soviet artillery, including huge concentrations of heavy guns and the devastating Katyusha rocket launchers, launched one of the largest bombardments the Italian army had ever experienced. For more than an hour, shells tore through trenches, pulverized bunkers, shattered communication lines, and threw regiments into chaos before Soviet infantry even began to advance. When the barrage lifted, Soviet armor surged forward. T-34 tanks, often leading columns of infantry, crossed the frozen Don or moved across improvised bridges built under fire. The Ravenna and Caesarea divisions, positioned at the Italian left, bore the full force of the initial Soviet assault. Their anti-tank guns failed to stop the advancing armor. Many Italian units, lacking radio communication and cut off by destroyed telephone lines, had no coordinated response. Battalion after battalion fell back or was overrun. Soviet mechanized units exploited the chaos, punching through gaps in the line and driving deep into the Italian rear areas, overrunning artillery positions, supply depots, and command posts. Entire regiments disappeared from the order of battle within hours. Attempts by German armored units to stabilize the front were delayed by snow, fuel shortages, and the overwhelming scale of the Soviet advance. Temperatures fell to brutal lows, sometimes below -30. Italian soldiers, lacking proper winter clothing, struggled even to march, let alone fight. Frostbite swept through the ranks. Rifles froze. Horses, the backbone of Italian logistics, died by the thousands, leaving supply columns immobilized. Medical services collapsed under the weight of the wounded. Field hospitals, when not overrun by Soviet troops, lacked everything from bandages to proper heating. Many wounded soldiers were left behind in snowbound villages or abandoned shelters, unable to move and without hope of rescue. By December 20, the Italian Eighth Army was collapsing. The Ravenna and Caesarea divisions were effectively destroyed. Survivors attempted to regroup on secondary defensive lines, but these too were quickly compromised by rapid Soviet breakthroughs. Soviet mechanized forces pressed onward, widening the breach and isolating new groups of Italian troops. With almost no motorized vehicles and facing deep snow, the Italian retreat quickly devolved into a desperate march on foot through freezing winds and constant enemy harassment. Soviet ski troops and partisans targeted stragglers. Ammunition ran low. Discipline weakened as the march stretched on. In early January 1943, the Soviet High Command expanded its offensive with Operation Ostrogozhsk, aimed at annihilating the remaining Axis forces along the Don. This phase fell heavily on the Alpini Corps, the Tridentina, Giulia, and Cuniense divisions, elite mountain troops trained for high-altitude warfare, but now trapped on the flat, frozen steppe with almost no anti-tank capability. The Giulia and Cuniense divisions were quickly encircled near Valyuki. Desperate breakout attempts failed. Most of their men were either killed or captured. Those who survived the fighting often perished later in Soviet captivity, where Italian POW mortality rates were among the highest of the war. The Tridentina division, under General Luigi Reverberi, managed to avoid encirclement and began a disciplined withdrawal westward. It soon became the core of a massive multinational column of survivors, Italians, Germans, and Hungarians alike, struggling through deep snow with almost no supplies. They melted snow for water, slaughtered dying horses for food, and marched through blizzards that reduced visibility to only a few meters. Exhausted soldiers collapsed along the route. Wounded men froze in the snow. Yet the column pressed on, hounded by Soviet forces at nearly every turn. On January 17, 1943, the retreating column reached the village of Nikolayevka, where a strong Soviet blocking force barred the way. With no food, no ammunition reserves, and no possibility of retreating farther east, the Alpini launched a desperate assault to break through. Accounts describe the attack as relentless. Italian artillery firing its last shells, infantry advancing through waist-deep snow, and officers leading charges by foot through machine gun fire. After hours of fighting, the Alpini broke the Soviet line, allowing thousands of survivors to escape. This battle, one of the most iconic moments in Alpini history, became a symbol of their discipline and tenacity. But the victory came at immense cost. The retreat continued for days afterward, with soldiers collapsing from exhaustion and frostbite. By the time the remnants of the Italian Eighth Army reached Axis territory, they were physically and psychologically shattered. Of the roughly 235,000 men who had originally marched into Russia, more than 110,000 were dead, missing, or captured. Most who fell into Soviet hands never returned. Divisions like the Giulia and Cuniense had been annihilated almost completely. The Torino, Pasubio, Ravenna, and Caesarea divisions ceased to exist as operational units. The collapse of the Italian Eighth Army was more than the destruction of a field force. It was the exposure of profound structural weaknesses within the Italian military machine. Poor equipment, inadequate winter clothing, insufficient anti-tank weapons, logistical failures, and overdependence on German priorities all contributed to the disaster. Meanwhile, the Red Army had learned from its earlier defeats. By late 1942, Soviet forces were better trained, better supplied, and capable of executing large-scale armored offensives with overwhelming effect. The consequences were wide-ranging. Militarily, the destruction of the Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian armies opened the way for deeper Soviet advances and helped seal the fate of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Politically, the losses undermined faith in Mussolini's regime, accelerating internal dissent and weakening Italy's will to continue the war. On the home front, families received notices of missing or captured loved ones, fueling bitterness and grief. The psychological impact of the defeat contributed to the collapse of fascist rule later in 1943. Survivors left behind testimonies describing days and nights spent marching through blizzards, rifles frozen solid, hands wrapped in rags, and comrades dying quietly in the snow. They wrote of the fear of Soviet tanks, the horror of artillery barrages, and the desperate struggle to stay alive when food, warmth, and hope all seemed to run out at once. These accounts, preserved in memoirs and archives, remain some of the most haunting records in Italian military history. Today, the plains along the Don River are quiet, but the memory of the Italian Eighth Army's collapse remains deeply etched in Italy's national consciousness. Monuments honor the fallen, particularly the alpini who fought at Nikolayevka, and the story of the retreat through the Russian winter endures as one of the darkest and most defining chapters in Italy's experience of the Second World War. The defeat stands as a stark reminder of the limits of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, inadequate preparation, and the unforgiving realities of the Eastern Front.